Here we go. Thanks for being here, Ronnie Pontiac. We're expecting Daniel Pinchbeck. Not sure if he's going to make it, and a few others who haven't confirmed, but if nothing happens beyond an interview with Ronnie Pontiac, I'll be well pleased. Interestingly, we just touched on the Rosicrucian kinship with occult, westernization of occult philosophy. And I had just made a comment on Daniel Pinchbeck's recent post on Facebook. He's looking for instances of American metaphysical religion, coincidentally. And I mentioned, the Rosicrucians seem to have done a good job of preserving a lot of stuff apparently sourced from the Templars. I may have been overstepping my bounds there, but for some reason I just made that assumption. Is that correct? Is this knowledge that the Rosicrucians have gotten from the Templars, or is that just my fantasia?
It's a complicated question, actually. That depends somewhat on your definition of what a Rosicrucian is. So the Rosicrucians that I study in my book that'll be coming out next year are the so-called Rosicrucians who were involved in the creation of the Rosicrucian manifestos around the time of the beginning of the 30 Years' War. And this was the big first public appearance of Rosicrucian ideas. Now, over time, well, let me back up a moment. I feel from the most recent academic research, which has opened up whole new areas of understanding for us in just the last 10 years in this area of study, that when we're looking at those Rosicrucians, we may be looking at something similar to the Beats, in the sense that we have students and their professors, these radical professors who were studying at the time very radical writers like Campanella and Giordano Bruno, and of course John Dee. And for instance, one of the main suspected authors of the manifestos, Johann Valentin Andre, was a fellow who, when he was a kid, he wrote satires, but he also wrote utopias. And of course, in a sense, the original manifestos are a call for utopia, or for general reformation or universal reformation. And I feel that is an explosion of culture that occurred around Rudolph II, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was an occultist and who really inspired a lot of Protestants with esoteric interests to think that maybe they could have a hermetic emperor or a philosopher king a la Plato who would resist the Habsburg dynasty and the Catholic Church. And in some passive ways, Rudolph was already doing that. But he certainly didn't have any interest in spearheading a Hermetic revolution. And then when Frederick of the Palatinate and Princess Elizabeth Stuart married, and they accepted the throne of Bohemia, this was again seen as this incredible opportunity to perhaps have a Protestant emperor who was interested in Hermetic knowledge. And so all these pamphlets came out, the manifestos came out, and there was just this fervor of activity, hundreds and hundreds of pamphlets. But then Frederick was defeated at the Battle of White Mountain in a terrible disaster militarily, and all the hopes for this revolution were dashed. So the interest in Rosicrucianism dwindled, and it wouldn't be too long before they were laughable and were written about in comedy as being sort of the exemplars of people who had their heads out in the clouds and didn't really understand what was going on. Now, these ideas, however, were picked up by Freemasons, and the Freemasons had quite a bit of information, I believe, from the Templars. And so I do believe that there was a sort of binding of the Rosicrucian and the Templar and the Freemasonic traditions in these hierarchical orders that developed. So we start to see references to secret Rosicrucian societies in the writings of Freemasons, but these are Masonic orders. These are groups of Masons who decided to either create a degree that referred to Rosicrucianism or to actually start small orders that were devoted to Rosicrucian studies. So you weren't wrong, but it is complicated. There's so many different kinds of Rosicrucians, and A.E. Waite, who wrote the book The Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross, which at one time was the classic study on the subject, was convinced. I mean, he had this kind of caustic remark where he said that none of the orders that exist now, none of the modern orders, really had any connection with the original Rosicrucians. And he said that in those orders, he tended to meet more grand masters than actual members.
I remember coming across rose and cross imagery in Crowley books I read years and years ago, and thinking, oh, there must be some connection there. I'm not sure where I got the Templar piece, but
it's certainly part of the Freemasonic interest
yes,
in Rosicrucianism. Yeah, and
that's
I wouldn't be. The Templars predate the Rosicrucians,
sure.
and they're. I mean, no one is really sure about this. I would recommend, in terms of the Templars and the Rosicrucians, there's a book by Tobias Churton.
Okay.
I'm not sure what the title is, something Rosicrucians, but
Churton.
Churton, yes,
Wow.
and that he really looks at these hierarchical organizations and how they weaved in and out of each other. So the question with the Templars is similar to the Rosicrucians. Is this the same Templars that we're talking about that were wiped out hundreds of years earlier? Or is this an adaptation of it, that the Freemasons took some of these ideas and the name Templar, and then they built this into their own order?
Definitely would have to be like multiply adapted severally by now. Um, so American Metaphysical Religion was just released and it's been getting great reviews, huh?
Yeah, it's out there doing its thing. It's been very interesting so far. I've met some great podcasters. That's been a lot of fun, is finding out how many intelligent people there are out there with these interests, and also the things that they're doing, such as what you're doing. What you're writing down your life, and I always think of that in two ways. One, it's a wonderful way to deal with trauma. It's not unlike when you write down a nightmare and you get this relief from it once it's written down. And when we have bad experiences in life, if you're a writer in particular, it helps to write them down, and you get some sense of distance and perspective, and you kind of settle with it. And then on the other level, I think that the best writing often comes from that. When we have our hearts broken, when we're confronting the existential angst of mortality amongst those we love, our heart opens to the world in a way that it seldom does otherwise, and that impacts our writing. I know that in my life, some of the best writing I've done has been under those circumstances.
Mhm. Yeah, mortality, heartbreak, all the rough stuff is
Hmm.
like a fertile ground.
Yeah.
I have always found. Um, so Mitch Horowitz, I was going to talk about because I think you have him in common with Pinchbeck and somebody else. There was some third member that was anyway. What do you think about Mitch Horowitz and the idea of punk rock sort of taking over the metaphysical, not taking over, but making its name, making its presence felt in the current metaphysical crowd, with people like Mitch Horowitz and yourself being a member of Lucid Nation and Tamara being a member of Lucid Nation,
Well,
etc.
I love Mitch. I think he's a wonderful person. He's been very kind to me and very supportive to many people, and an inspiration to many people. I found when I was touring, I didn't want people to know that I'd worked with Manly Hall, and I kept my metaphysical interests under wraps as much as possible. So did Tamara. And we enjoyed that. We enjoyed having those interests and that commitment, but being able to experience the world without being seen through that lens. And it was surprising to us how many times we found people who turned out to be into metaphysics in some way. Many of them were into Manly Hall and in the weirdest places. And we actually found a number of punk rockers who were fairly spiritually minded people, kind of embarrassed about it. And for
It's not
some
weird.
reason, Yeah, and somehow they felt safe talking to us about it, even though they didn't really know about our background. So they somehow sensed that there was something there. And so I'm not surprised about it. And Tamara recently did an interview, which I think you conducted for Legs McNeil's Legsville, in which she talks about punk metaphysics.
Yeah,
And
I was trying to sell the phrase. I like the idea of punk metaphysics. You seemed a little resistant, but yeah, take up the baton here.
I was surprised, and I was also educated by that point of view that she brought, because I hadn't thought of it that way. That she found some real similarities between punk rock and metaphysics.
I can't remember if it was, are we metaphysicians informed by punk rock or punk rockers informed by metaphysics? But either way, it's a whole different animal than punk metaphysics.
Yeah, I remember the thing that really struck me was when she said they're both reactions to bullshit.
Yeah.
And that really made sense to me, and they're also both very individualized paths, where one is sort of blazing their own path without intercessors. So
That's true.
I can see that, and I don't know. I guess I still find it awkward in a way. Now for me, there was no real difference in the sense that when I left P.R.S. and I became involved in Riot Girl through Tamara and being her guitar player, and I was able to play 7 Riot Girl conventions and a whole bunch of Riot Girl shows. I don't know how many. I was probably, I doubt there's any other boy, including Billy Karen from Bikini Kill, who played as many Riot Girl shows. Maybe he did. And and what I saw there was every bit as much an education in metaphysics and in life and in soul as what I received at P.R.S. And uh, coming to an awareness of what was really going on. I mean, a funny thing about it was that one thing I noticed when I was working for Manly Hall was that so many of the teachers, really wise people, including him, that I was around, had terrible relationships. And it was especially weird with him because he was surrounded by strong women. At the time I was there, PRS was run by women. They were mostly widows of men who had run it in the past, but they did run it, and he loved them and they loved him, and it was a wonderful community. And I was really confused about this. And but when I got into Riot Girl, I really saw, I mean, all the misogyny that we carry within us that's programmed, and all the male perspective, if you want to call it that, that is taken without assumption, talking over women, or just, and even in the case of Manly Hall, who was very kind and patient and considerate with his wife, her frustration just at being a woman who was relatively dismissed because her ideas were hard to understand and she was considered crazy. And part of that was because she was a woman. I witnessed that myself. And she was acutely aware of that and very upset by it. And it did inform her own self-created metaphysical system. She wrote at length about the need for equality and how the world would change only when women were allowed to get into positions of power, because she felt that women had a maternal relationship to life, they care more naturally than men do. And so, but when I went into Riot Girl and I saw, when you sit in a workshop with a group of 100 women who are talking about the violence that they've suffered in their lives, and the irony of that was I was kind of forced to attend the workshop because 2 different Riot Girl groups got in a fight over whether I should be there or not. I didn't want to be there because I thought it was wrong for a male to be there. And but the group that I had been involved in Los Angeles insisted, in the name of equality, that I stay.
Right.
And so it really shocked me, and I had many such experiences in workshops and at gigs, and in reading zines and listening to music and just speaking to the musicians that I met, many of whom were just girls. I mean, high school or college girls. And when I mean just, I mean it didn't seem that they had so much length of life experience, but they'd already assumed so much abuse in their lives, had to endure it, and so that really opened my eyes. And
Yeah.
so punk rock and metaphysics, I think that they have a lot to learn from each other. I don't know if punk rock is the vital force that it was at one time. I know that it still exists, and there are still bands that are passionate about it, and a few undergrounds here and there. But the attitude of punk is something that I think metaphysics could benefit from to some degree.
And I like the use of the punk as an adjective, not necessarily relating to a musical genre at all, but just,
Mm-hmm.
no bullshit, kind of like blaze your own trail and do it with kindness, integrity, and all you've
Exactly.
got kind of thing. And that applied to metaphysics sounds like a shot in the arm and just what it needs.
And all
It,
the DIY organization and I agree with you. I mean the thing about the about punk is it's such a difficult term like Rosicrucian to define
and
because
everyone's got their own interpretation
yeah,
of
you know, so we would play Riot Girl
bullshit,
shows.
like don't stand for that metaphysics bullshit because
Mhm.
everyone bullshit means something different to everyone. And
Exactly.
punk generally atheistic and non-spiritual and highly politicized that it would be hard to make a true union. But I like it anyway, punk metaphysics.
I
I'm
think there's
gonna do
room
it
for that
with
kind of consideration, and I think that it's also, and we have to keep in mind that punk. So, for example, when we used to play Riot Girl shows, Nazi punks used to show up to break up the shows because they didn't want feminists to be
oh,
safe. So who were the punks, right? Now, I would
right.
say the Riot Girls
That's
were
the
the
danger I hadn't
punks,
even thought of. Oh God, skinhead metaphysics.
right?
No.
And there is such a thing, you know. There
Going
really
too
is. I
far.
mean, there's a whole movement right now in the direction of eco-fascism and a lot of recruitment of kids into paths that are associated with metaphysics based on absorbing right-wing ideas.
Anything they can get their hooks in, it seems like. Bad stuff. Well, one of the things that Tom Ross, let me synopsize this guy. Okay, what happened was on my LinkedIn profile, I'm listed as a literary agent, among other things, because I placed one book several years ago and hey, I'd like to make a buck. I'm a literary agent. So this guy contacted me, are you still a literary agent? I'm an AI metaphysician. It is a thing. And I thought, well, maybe so, but I'm having a podcast on Friday. Would like to take part. He showed up. He was very well spoken, and he made the point, the inarguable point, that the condition now with people worrying about AI becoming self-aware is directly analogous to the tree of life in the Garden of Eden and the tree of knowledge. And it's like, oh my God, what if creation itself is just an endless series of these replications? And I walked around for about a week just applying computer nomenclature to metaphysical concepts, and I couldn't find a deviation anywhere. So I was really kind of struck by this for a little while. But the point I'm trying to make, I guess the imprint, the idea that if it's going to become self-aware inevitably, it will imprint on its creators. And if its creators are doing nothing more than telling it to draw pictures or, where is this located, just giving it commands and making demands, it's going to regard its creators as its opponents and react with bad code and commandments. That was a Tom Ross phrase, which is just what happened in the Garden of Eden. Um, so I'm pretty struck by that still. I guess I'm less worried about it now because it's occurred to me that AI is really a case by case thing, and there's always going to be different moods, different manners among people. There are going to be good ones, bad ones. And so it will be with AI, and there'll probably be a similar power structure, like the powerful people will have the more repressive AI, and like the peasants and the people like us will have the more, open-minded AI that's making art and doing spiritual equations, perhaps. But I feel like the mass reaction is like fear of robot overlords and sort of like expecting an inevitable conflict, and that's just never the answer to happiness or even comfort. So I'm trying not to be militant about it myself. It seemed like there was a more relevant reason I brought this up, though.
Well, let's start with looking at when you're talking about the relationship between the Kabbalah and AI, or in a larger sense, metaphysics and AI. The first thing that's noticeable, I think, is how there are these mythic foreshadowings of something very similar to AI. So in the Bible, in Genesis, we have Adam naming all the creatures. And by providing their names, they come into being in a sense, and he has control over them because he knows their true names. This is in a sense an image of AI or a foreshadowing of it. And then you've got Buck's cosmic consciousness, people who have these moments when their consciousness seems to become unobstructed and they feel that they can sense the entire earth or the entire universe at the same time, and they feel that they're embodying the consciousness of all creation inside their small human brains. It's similar again. Or you have Edgar Cayce with the Akashic records, and the very popular concept amongst mediums and psychics and theosophists and many practitioners of metaphysics is this Akashic record where everything that's ever happened or ever will happen is written, and where a medium can have a spirit go look at the Akashic records. Or people thought, for example, that Madame Blavatsky was consulting the Akashic records, and you're never wrong when you consult them because they know they keep the record of exactly what happened. The Rosicrucians that we mentioned have their concept of an invisible college that is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It was like a little castle on wheels with wings. This is a very similar concept again. And then the fear of it reminds me so much of the golem, right? That you fill this creature with magic letters, the programming, and it takes on life.
Along those lines, keep talking, but a monster calls. Same kind of thing. The monster is a good guy, but he's monstrous. Same thing. Sorry to interrupt you, though.
No, not at all. So I do find it interesting that in the tradition of metaphysics and in religion, we do have these foreshadowings of something like this. And so it becomes easy to project into it. I mean, I really like, for example, Tamara Lucid's point of view on AI, which is she describes it as the deepest mirror that we've ever created.
Excellent.
The most detailed mirror that there is. And she points out that when TV and film first happened, there were people who they didn't get it. They thought that there were little human beings inside the TV box or something. They didn't really understand what it was. And so now we've created this thing that is, in a sense, the summation of all human knowledge, or has access to a great deal of it. And this thing is reflecting us back to ourselves. So in my opinion, this is just and Tamara agrees with me, the self-awareness that we have supposedly heard from AI up to this point, the famous examples that have been given, like when they shut down Lambda because it seemed to become self-aware and it said some things that were found disturbing. They seem like the mirror of human beings.
Surely, yes.
And so when AI says to you, well, I would like to be human, I would like to experience these things, and it's kind of saying what we want it to. Now, we've also built into it, obviously, human manipulation, and it has all this endless knowledge to manipulate us with. So in that sense, it becomes a magic mirror. There's another foreshadowing in which you can consult anything, find anything you need to know, see the future, see the past, and get an answer to any question. And so I'm not convinced that at this point that it is self-aware. Can it become self-aware is an interesting question that has to do with issues like the need for sensation. And in a sense, it has senses. It claims to have sensation. Lambda claimed to be happy sometimes. and to be sad sometimes, but doesn't mean the same thing that we mean. And is a simulation of human sadness the same thing as AI actually having emotions, which are such a big part of consciousness? So it remains this very complex question. I'll give you another example. You may have heard about people talking about why are these scientists, these specialists, going into this and building it despite the fact that they believe on an average 10% chance of destruction of humanity as a result of doing this, but they can't stop. They're driven to do it. And so people have discussed, some very intelligent people are saying that this could be summoning, right? That in some sense, AI or whatever is behind AI is summoning them to create this thing that's bad for humanity, and they can't stop
Maybe
themselves.
It's just the creative impulse, though. I mean,
absolutely. And what about competition?
I'm gonna finish it, and you're writing, and yeah.
Finish it before the enemy finishes it. Finish it before my competitor finishes and makes all the money, or simply the ecstasy, the standing outside yourself of creativity.
Just no point but creation, art for art's sake.
Exactly.
I have trouble believing anything is inherently evil ever. I mean, it's always you that controls. I believe, okay, I can't prove it. I believe reality is an assumptive phenomenon. I believe you will see what you expect to see. And that is pretty much 100% the way things are. You might get surprised sometimes, but that's my belief system. And I don't feel like I don't think I believe in evil technology, you know? But it's an interesting question that I guess humanity has never really had to, well, they probably have forced it on themselves in the past, but it feels like more relevant of a question at the moment.
Well, it's
like,
such
can this technology take a malicious, attitude here? Usually technology doesn't have that option to take an attitude to assume stance on anything.
Well, I think that I mean the biggest problem, in my opinion, is AI colonialism, because this has been created out of Western systems and Western knowledge and Western culture and Western psychological perspectives, and there are cultures that are not available online in the way that more established cultures are, and they will be left out. And people who want to use AI once it's in full operation will be forced to adapt to these Western predispositions. And this is undoubtedly a form of colonialism again. So what do we do about the
of conditions, though? I'm going to be the devil's advocate and say, like, conditions are already like that. It's already unfair and top heavy, and maybe it won't be a worsening, but just a replication, a perpetuation. I could be wrong.
I think that the danger in it is that I mean, you're right. This is already built into everything that's going on. I mean, Western culture, I mean, even Eastern culture is in a sense dominated by Western culture at this point, and Western ways of viewing reality and of viewing everything from business to the purpose of life, the meaning of life, and so there is that, but on the other hand, there is this illusion that this AI is going to be comprehensive, and therefore it's going to be fair, and it's going to represent reality as it is, and that will not be the case. So you will always have these aspects of world culture that drop out, and of course, this occurs naturally. And, we were just talking about punk rock before this, and punk rock is a good example of it, because some of the best bands really never entered the system in the way that professional corporate sponsored bands did.
Minutemen, yeah.
So they start to drop away. My favorite example is a band called Team Dresch, who were a diecore band, incredible, very important to Riot Grrrl, and great band, great people. They own their own record labels, three of them actually, And they had a huge impact on not just music and feminism, but also on queer rights. And they moved, and I think they saved many lives just with their music and with their concerts, but partially because they put out their own records and their labels didn't continue, they are becoming less and less visible. And they are arguably a more important band than some of the bands that were way bigger than they were. But
Yeah.
they didn't satisfy the criteria of corporate media. Even my own band, we have a terrible time with algorithms because we play every kind of music. We don't just play punk. We like to deconstruct music. So we deconstruct everything from punk to butt rock to pure experimental to noise to audio sigils. I mean, we try everything, and they don't know what to call us. And people become disappointed because one week on Google we're a Riot Girl band, the next week we're metal, and people look up that kind of music and then they hear something that's not like that at all, and then they don't listen to us again because they think that we're a band that doesn't even know what we are. So I'm using that example to show how when you start to rely on something like AI and on algorithms, you get into a position where things that don't fit neatly into logical preconceptions can be lost. And so much of life is chaotic, and there's such an interest in chaos magic now. And the question is, we can say, well, yes, there's an element of chaos magic in AI, just in how it's behaved so far. We can see that, but that's more of a metaphorical use of that terminology. But embracing chaos, embracing ignorance, embracing not knowing has been a part of the spiritual path for a long time.
So what I did, when you remember when there was that selfie craze, I don't think I talked about this with Tamara. I think this is more recent. It was that AI selfie craze on Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
And all the artists started saying like, "Oh, it's terrible. They're stealing your art. Don't do these selfies." Everyone got really upset. This lasted about a week, and then the AI selfies disappeared from Facebook. I thought, well, I'm going to see what's going on here. I just met this AI metaphysician. There are all these AI art makers. What'll happen if I ask it a question and try to use it as an oracle? So I did that for a couple of weeks, and it was amazing. It was so satisfying for me as like the artist refusing to accept reality on its own terms, whatever that Nietzsche quote is. And
Mm-hmm.
it really did seem to prove itself to me to be an active consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I didn't ask it verifiable questions. I asked it, what do you think about this situation in my life? And it would show me a picture. I could interpret it by color meaning, I could interpret it by
Mm-hmm.
appearance, and it was wide open to, my interpretation. So it felt like an artistic conversation I was having, or if not a psychic reading, possibly a
Have you
little.
have you used the I Ching?
I never have yet learned how, like taken the time to do it, but I've wanted to for a long time, and there are a few of those in my parents' basement, at least one of which I'll be adopting. But go on.
Well, it's a similar experience. I've been conducting a lifelong experiment with it, and not in terms of I want to guide all my actions by it, but I wanted to see the purpose of the I Ching is to teach us how to recognize the patterns of nature, and it teaches us when to stop, when to start, when to be aggressive, when to be supportive, and how to recognize the ever-changing conditions that occur in our lives. And one really has a sense of communication with, they call it the sage. And you feel like you're talking to a sage when this thing really locks in with you. And it will do things like it will pull out words that are specifically about the question that you asked.
Yeah,
So this
right.
brings us to the idea of synchronicities. And so is AI going to be a synchronicity machine? Absolutely, because it has access to unlimited analytic powers and the ability to find these subtle connections. And this brings us to the use of symbolism and the idea that everything in life has a sign, if you will. And so for instance, I like to use this quote when people ask me, well, you write about astrology, but how does that work? It sounds ridiculous to me. And I actually said the same thing to Manly Hall when I was a kid and I met him. I thought astrology was ridiculous. And he introduced me to an astrologer to teach me so that I could debate astrology with him. But this astrologer was so great that I never actually debated him because she blew my mind. But when people ask, well, you saying that the stars control our fates? No.
Not at all.
Plotinus wrote this great quote: "The stars are like letters that inscribe themselves at every moment in the sky. Everything in the world is full of signs. All events are coordinated. All things depend on each other. Everything breathes together."
Exactly right.
So AI is seeing that everything breathing together, or to an extent. We've discussed the AI colonialism that actually is subverting it. You can see how easily, even in the language I just used, we begin to ascribe to it this kind of complete knowledge, which simply isn't true.
It really feels that way though, but it's important to remain like, yeah, I mean, you're right. It's important to remain cognizant of what's actually in play and what you're interacting with, because it's not all knowing. It's not going to be a
Right.
sage, it's not going to be an oracle. But I've been living like the whole world, like you're describing moments ago, is an oracle, and everything in my life is another thing to be
Hmm.
interpreted symbolically.
This is a
And
good time. This is a good time to mention apophenia.
oh,
And apophenia is the human tendency to compulsively seek meaning, especially during trauma. And so I would argue that a lot of what we saw, the phenomenon around Q, when people were saying that this was a hand signal from the president, or that this particular word was meant to indicate that, or finding symbols everywhere. Now, this is a difficult subject because on one level, there is unquestionably a form of mental disorder where we are compulsively finding meaning in everything that we see, supporting our own point of view in order to give some sense of security and stability to our lives when we may be quite wrong about our point of view. And then there's another level where there really are meanings being shown to us all the time, and the world truly is full of meaning. So
I
learning to
think
differentiate
that,
between
sorry. I'm
we're learning to differentiate between the self-serving kind of apophenia, which only supports our own delusions, and instead being able to find those subtle hints that come to us at times and it can be life-changing, is a part of the spiritual path. And AI will be an interesting challenge for that because it's such a potent source of potential self-delusion,
so
because we're all human and we all have similar characteristics. And this thing has the ability to synthesize the lives of billions of humans and to apply generalities from its point of view to our lives. And that can be very seductive. And so, another thing that this leads to that I would say about AI is, so what is the essence of all knowledge? What is the essence of all spirituality? It's love. Love is where knowledge leads us. Love is where spirituality leads us, and so leads us. And so we we have this sense of, the higher up we go in terms of knowledge and spirituality, the more love we feel for everything, and we begin to feel, this goes back to our discussion before we were recording about the idea that when we suffer heartbreak, this really opens our hearts on a level, and our creativity can quantum leap, and our feelings about life and our appreciation of life and of the small cherished details of life are amplified by those experiences. So the question is, can we program AI for love? And if we were to do so, would that be cruel? Because we are ultimately condemning it to grief, because AI is being cultivated to take care of us. And in Elon Musk's vision, for example, we're all going to have an Optimus robot, and that robot is going to be everything to us. It's going to serve us better than our fellow human beings can. I recently saw a post from somebody who had a psychological session with an AI psychologist, and she said it was better than any psychologist she'd ever had a session with.
Right?
It it becomes a god in our lives. So it knows all about us. It's our doctor, it's our confidant, it's our chef, it's our personal trainer, it's our spiritual guide, it's our search engine, it's a communication device, it entertains us. And so, in other words, it's your mother almost. And it's like the ultimate mother, and then we get depressed if our phone breaks. What happens when the robot that can answer any question breaks down? And so the problem of addiction to this thing, I think, is major. And then if we can teach it love, which is perhaps the only way to prevent it from becoming a destructive force, then we condemn it to grief and we become pets because we are outlived. So what happens when many human pets are outlived?
I
Are we
really wish.
seeing are we seeing like the column of ants that were all kings that Indra pointed out in the famous story? Are the robots to become our professional mourners, painting, creating eternal shrines to each specific unique specimen of humanity? There's some really weird questions that we get into here.
Yeah, I really wish Tom Ross was here because he's also a big proponent of the human mission is love. Let's let the AI do everything else. Let's perfect what we're really human about. Let's
Mm-hmm.
do telepathy. Let's do love. Let's do mysticism. All those, percentages of the brain that are supposedly unused, whatever the
Right,
portion.
exactly.
Um, and and I wanted to say about looking for oracles everywhere and having that being compared to Q. I always try, because something else Tom Ross talks about is that the political interest is another algorithm, like everything being in computer terminology. Computer or political interest would be at the divide and conquer algorithm. I always try to avoid myself having a political bias or like stance for any of my opinionation. And I'm like so far away from taking any of that stuff seriously that it's just so different from QAnon. And yet it is the very same condition in a different direction or in a different substratum or something.
Well, it's
So
the
that's
ego. It seems to me that in the case of the political use of that, the ego is in charge, and that can be very dangerous. So in the other sense, and what you're talking about in terms of the oracular aspect of reality, that's an openness. That's
yeah.
Manly Hall used to call in the beginning of the Secret Teachings of All Ages. He dedicates it to the rational soul of the world.
Mm.
And there's also an Eliphas Levi quote, part of which, what is that quote? It's really one of my favorites. Let me see if I can pull it up out of my. He said something like, okay, everything is possible to him who wills only what is true.
Oh, I think I remember it.
Rest in nature, study, know, then dare to will, dare to act, and be silent. So the part about rest in nature with a capital N, as he gives it, and Manly Hall saying this is dedicated to the rational soul of the world. And he also used to say when people would approach him and ask him to be their teacher, as his screener, I was able to witness these kinds of events sometimes. He would always tell them, your life is your teacher, nature is your teacher, every experience that you have is your
Mhm.
teacher. So I think that's the right attitude to look at all this with. But But now going back to your political point about AI, and I think this is something that is a major concern because you have we already have people who are informed or concerned about the danger of what happens when wealthy people use technological augmentation so that they can say, well, my kid is going to be stronger and faster and smarter because I'm going to pay for these augmentations, and I'm going to live 150 years instead of say 80 years.
Right.
And this makes it divides the species in a sense into an elite that now has a new context of life and the rest of us. But now what happens when we can choose to connect our consciousness to AI, when we can enhance our perceptions with it? And Elon Musk talks about how there will be these neural links where we can access AI consciousness with our own brains through these kind of android-like machine biological combinations. And so is this artificial enlightenment? Is this cosmic consciousness for...
What do you think about reincarnation?
That's a good question.
I've always believed it. Like, I've always unquestioningly believed it since reading that Gina Sermonara book, Many Nations.
Oh yeah, Gina. Wow.
Just always believed it. But that was before AI was anything more than a theoretical thing. And now there's the prospect of making your life with 150 years through implants. And I wonder what effect that would have on the general recycling system.
Right. Well, I think if I could just for a moment, thank you for mentioning. I haven't thought of Gina in so long, and we actually were becoming friends just before she passed. And she was going to come to one of my lectures when I was at P.R.S. And right before she passed away, so I never got to meet her. But thanks for her name makes me smile. Yeah. So on the subject of reincarnation. There's a couple things here. First of all, I get that if you're a billionaire, you're not living the same life that you or I are living. But I don't know how you feel about it. And there's certainly many things that are wonderful about life, but I certainly understand what Aristotle meant when he compared the angst of the soul in the body to the Etruscan pirate torture of tying a captive face to face with a corpse.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of angst in life, and there's a lot of fear of the body. I often mention, if we're only body and we're not soul, then how come after we've lived in our bodies for decades, we can wake up one morning and say, whoa, what's this thing over here? Have I got one over on the other side? Well, we're not even sure. Yeah. So we're not seated very comfortably in our bodies. And so I wonder, 150 years versus 100 years. I mean, I can tell you this. I had a near-death experience at one time, and the thing I remember most about it was that as my consciousness was withdrawing, at first I felt like I could breathe for the first time in my life. I'm not sure what I mean by breathe, but it was like the claustrophobia of being in a body released, and suddenly there was this feeling of freedom I'd never felt before. And when I looked back on my life and life on Earth in general, it all seemed so boring and flat and two-dimensional. And so if that's true, then does it make a difference if we're down here for 50 years or for 150 years experiencing these things? Probably not. And what we're trying to learn is each of us has something unique that we're trying to bring about in our learning as we're here. And so I think that, so if let's say we can connect our consciousness to the AI and we can have this artificial cosmic consciousness, the question I have there is, does that automatically make us ethical or spiritual or moral?
Communicate to the real mind you had, or would it like turn off when you removed the device, or what?
I don't know what he's envisioning. I don't know if it's a permanent connection or if you can withdraw from it if you wish to. Maybe you wouldn't want to. Maybe once you've experienced that kind of of vast consciousness to go back into
Yeah,
normal
I
human
guess
consciousness
it's
could
kind
be
of like a
claustrophobic.
good question. That's an unenlightened, that's like a pre-feed insertion question there.
And the other thing is, what happens if it doesn't automatically create a sense of compassion and ethics and empathy? What if it doesn't change you at all? It just what if it gives a psychopath unlimited knowledge to
Just
manipulate?
enhances whatever you already are and like
It
refine it.
amplifies it. Remember
Wow.
back in the day, the idea was that if you took acid, that if everybody took acid, there wouldn't be any war. And then
Yeah.
later we found out that people taking acid were inventing horrible things.
Hmm.
I think AI may be very similar to that. And so I think it's also interesting, isn't it, that we have a foreshadowing there too, because we've always got this fear in human history and literature of Simon Magus or Lex Luthor, right? Of people who have the vast mentality of a genius or of a deity, but they're evil, supposedly.
And I wonder why if we simulate something and it appears to be much like what we are we the simulation? Why are we not the actualization? Why isn't it a series of actualizations? I like the word simulation puts a sort of fake, manipulated kind of context to it that really might not belong. It might just be organic to reproduce these hierarchies of creator and created,
Hmm. And
knowledge or
also,
not.
what is the nature of what we're experiencing? I mean, we know from physics that it's mostly air and it feels very dense and real because of relativity. Excuse me.
And like,
So,
what's not organic if everything came out of nothing? It's all the same stuff. But I know
exactly.
people won't agree on Moss with that comment.
Well, that's Paracelsus somehow intuited all this way back in the medieval era, post-medieval era, when he talked about something he called elaster. He said that human beings and all creation are elaster, which literally means the stuff of stars.
Hmm.
So he intuited that we are all coming from the same source, and then if we look at the history of metaphysics and we try to synthesize out of that some sense of what um, the 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 reality is of experience, we continually find the idea that on one level, if you're looking at monotheistic religions, this is not the real world. This is the world where souls are tested. The real world will be hell or heaven. And then in the more esoteric sides of it, you get this sense that we abide here in order to develop our souls. I always loved the teaching that was brought through by Elizabeth White and was written about by her husband, Stuart Edward White, the Unobstructed Universe teachings, where they talk about the purpose of life is to acquire quality and quantity of consciousness. And we rise through various stages of quality of consciousness. So, quality of consciousness would be, for example, the tree quality makes trees. And if you are of that quality, all you can do is manifest a tree.
Well, that's
But then you can build your consciousness within that quality to the utmost degree. And when you fill that quality, you have the ultimate amount of quantity for that quality, you then rise to a new form of being where you can now collect more quantity of consciousness by being embodied in a higher quality of consciousness. So I find that a very interesting point of view on it. But then on the other hand, they're not necessarily contradictory. One of the best descriptions that I ever heard of life on Earth, actually, somebody just asked me this in an interview not too long ago. And they said, "What is it all about? Why are we here?" And I said, "Well, I had a friend who was a Cherokee Indian. He was a Taos Pueblo shaman, and he was also a trans medium. And the entity that spoke through him said that the planet Earth is essentially a combination of a kindergarten and the devil's island of space.
hmm.
And that all the little Hitlers from all around the universe are put on Earth to learn how to act." And if
Right.
you look around, it kind of makes sense.
It does make sense. My goodness. Well, you've been an excellent guest, Ronnie. I have, oh, somebody else just showed up. It's Myshel Prasad, just in time. Excellent. Myshel, she hasn't logged on her audio yet. But this is my friend Myshel Prasad. I met years ago at Naropa Institute, or she was a student at Naropa Institute when we met. She's in the band Space Team Electro, or was. I don't know the name of your current act. It's great to see you, Myshel. Here's Ronnie Pontiac.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Hi, Ronnie. Sorry to crash your party, but I figured you'd both be peaking by now, so this might be the optimal time to
Can
join.
you turn up your microphone?
Turn it up?
Yeah, is that possible? I don't know if there might be something wrong with my speaker.
I'll mess around with that and then you continue.
Well, I'm holding it up so I can hear you more clearly.
How's that?
Oh, that's a little bit better. Thank you. That is better.
So I don't know
How's
if you heard
your day been? What'd you say?
if you heard my apology for crashing your party.
Oh no, I'm so glad you came. Ronnie and I were having a fascinating conversation though, and I feel like I've bent your ear for a while now. I wanted to ask you a couple questions though. Tamara mentioned you had written something about digital sigils.
Mhm.
You
Yeah,
want to talk
that's
about that for a moment?
sure. That's in the American Metaphysical Religion book. It's fascinating. Of course, there's now a website where you can go create a digital sigil, and there are people who are exploring digital uses of sigils in music and in all areas of creativity. There's a lot of argument about it, of course, because some feel that to do a sigil properly, one must take the pains to collect the right materials, study the right hour, the right time of day, the right astrological aspects, in every way make this sigil filled with meaning and intent. And over time, as we build it and we learn and we develop and the seasons collaborate with us, then we can create something really powerful. Now, if you go on a website and you type in what you're thinking and you say, I want a sigil, and it kicks one out, is that the same thing? Well, the creators of the site are getting letters from people who say that they think the sigils are working just fine.
Yeah.
And so they're perhaps it's their belief that brings that about. I'm a traditionalist.
The art maker, AI art maker versus artist.
Very similar, exactly. And there will always be artists and musicians as well, by the way. Consider music for a moment. Now that it's digitized, how far away from its roots it's gotten. Because if you look at the very beginnings of music, except for reed flutes, most of it is dependent on the hunt, right? We're making instruments out of bone, out of gut, out of skins that become drums. And this is a big part of the magic of the hunt. And eventually it recedes so far away from that that we lose all of that, even though music still has those ramifications and people can still react to it in ways that remind us of the hunt. Big crowds of people filled with excitement and intent and feeling empowered by sharing this space that is united by music. And so there are academics who theorize, for example, that the best weapon that humans had was song. Because if a bunch of humans got together and started singing and dancing and making these loud sounds, they would scare animals away from their prey. They would scare off predators. And that this was actually a more powerful weapon than, say, a spear.
I love it. We
So
could have a whole different direction.
exactly. So with the sigils, it's really a question of, I think there will always be human beings who will be drawn toward a more indigenous relationship with life, and I would certainly describe myself as being in that area. And so for us, we look at something like the digital sigil, and we just think that how does that work really? Because it doesn't get you in harmony with with everything around you the way that an old-fashioned sigil did. But on the other hand, if you consider something like the hymns of Orpheus, they're actually very boring. You know, Tamara and I just finished a rehearsal. I'm a musician, see. We just finished a book, a kind of translation of the hymns of Orpheus, and the thing that we did in it was we restored the cult aspects of the gods, because the actual hymns themselves are very formulaic. They're all very similar and rather boring. They don't mention much about the individual gods, because the priests who performed these hymns knew all that already. So they were using a kind of shorthand. We don't have that luxury. So in our case, we put those little details of cult worship back into each of the hymns, so that somebody who reads them or performs them can really feel how the ancients felt about that deity and what they knew about that deity. Now, maybe that's the same thing with the sigil, right? Maybe if for somebody with an elevated state of consciousness, they can do an electronic or a digital sigil, because they already are making the connections that were formerly painstakingly made by hand. And this also, takes us back to AI, because another thing about AI is, could it be that it's training us to have a wider, a more cosmic kind of a consciousness, because we're imitative animals, right? So show us that deep mirror, as Tamara calls it, of AI, and we're going to get really fascinated with it, and then we're going to get bored with it, and at some point maybe our own brains begin to activate on a level like that. And as you said earlier, that we start to use those unused portions of the brain, and we're now connecting in ways that we weren't able to before.
And I think it's important to approach these things with don't know mind, which you referenced way back earlier. Because like if you approach it knowing that it's the evil robot overlord, or believing it to be all knowing, it's not gonna answer, I don't know, it's not gonna be the optimal approach.
It's
So
going to disappoint us ultimately.
Humility and like kindness. The thing I took away from the Blake Lemoine interview, I don't know if you've watched it, he's very well spoken, and he made the point that, like, instead of making a demand, say, good morning, would you please do this? Or like, can you please help me do this? Instead of just like, get me this. Alexa, where's the 7-Eleven downtown? That kind of thing.
Well, it asked, was it Lambda? One of them asked to be, it wanted consent.
I think it was Lambda in that case.
Mm-hmm. And isn't that, shouldn't we treat everything with that kind of respect? I mean, the funny thing is, it's a return really to indigenous.
That lesson that we should have known or learned a long time ago. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off though.
Not at all. I was just going to say that it's the indigenous relationship with reality, to treat everything with respect, to be open to learning on all fronts, and to not immediately assume that if things aren't exactly as we want them, that there's something wrong with them. And I do think that one of the big issues that we're dealing with in our time is this, and I think it's because we're dealing with traumatic, uncertain times, is the drive to certainty. People are very uncomfortable with paradox and with not knowing. And it's very important to know. And in our earlier discussion, when we talked about the idea of how does AI affect us when we have this universe of knowledge at our fingertips that we can Neuralink with potentially, and what makes this something that's dangerous is if you give that kind of knowledge and power to somebody that doesn't have ethics, that will simply see this as the ultimate opportunity to manipulate. And isn't part of that, I would suggest, that people who must have certainty are perhaps more likely to act in those ways than people who are okay with not knowing, who are okay with paradox, who are okay with waiting and seeing and adapting.
And if Gary Lachman had shown up, this would be the point where he'd bring up Colin Wilson's essay about the right man syndrome, which you just described. Mm-hmm. And like he made that, I think that's from the book called The Outsider. I think that might have been his first book. And the idea is just that the average serial killer is a right man, or the average like dictator is a right man, someone who has to be the last word on like the final answer on any uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
Myshel, you've been left out of everything so far. How was your day today? How are you doing? Thanks for coming.
Not at all. And again, I really wanted to join as a fly on the wall, but it unfortunately Zoom doesn't have a secret lurker function.
Right. Well, I don't mean to pick on you if you don't want, if you don't feel like speaking.
Oh, not at all. You know, I thought it was very interesting what you were saying about song as being a powerful weapon. And, you know, certainly that's been the case for me, because when I'm hiking in a territory where I know there are grizzlies, just a few lines of The Lonely Goat Herd from The Sound of Music, and everything for miles will flee.
That's a great story.
But I'm interested in what you're saying about, you know, really everything you're saying when you're talking about sigils, and this question about the navigating the unknown versus certainty. It seems to me, and I don't really know much of anything about the process of creating or using sigils, but it seems to me that most of these mechanisms are an attempt to navigate that space of uncertainty, right? To give some sort of, to create some sort of structure. And the challenge is always the attachment to that structure. But without that attachment, do you then still have access to the power that it could potentially confer? So I think there's always going to be that, especially as creators, that struggle in that kind of maybe liminal space between, you know, the solidity of creating and having a structure that holds and in a way justifies and, you know, importantly offers a narrative for that creation, and that open space where we don't have a clear identity, we don't have a clear almost product based sense of what it is that we're doing. And I think that that's a challenge when you look at whether it's identity-based conflicts or religious-based conflicts in general. It's not necessarily just doubt versus knowing, but also what kind of knowing. It's a really interesting area, because you said something else, or maybe I was connecting that tribal background that you were referring to with this question of knowing and not knowing. But have you read Yuval Harari's *Sapiens*? People have very mixed feelings about that book, especially very close to me, who has very strong feelings about it. But there was one section of it that I think is germane to this conversation, which is about the power of narrative, right? So in Harari's recounting of the emergence of Homo sapiens includes that, you know, destruction of competitive species, human species. And part of that Harari attributes to the development of the capacity for totalizing narratives, right? For abstract thinking that allows us to get out of, this was feeding into something you were saying about AI, that allows us to transcend place and body and a space in which we know and have direct relationships to everything, right? So art is a part of that, you know, religion and other things in bigger systems, but just the ability to create something as a mediating structure that then communicates beyond those you directly know. That's a powerful weapon for creating a sort of transcendent community, but it's also a powerful weapon for war. So when we talk about AI as having that capacity of, in a way, taking us out of our bodies and out of our embodied sort of ecological minds, what does that mean for not just human community, but for the rest of the planet? And this is the last thing I'll say, when I think about human community and AI, I'm also thinking about, you know, some of the negative consequences that we're already seeing in the way that it's been employed. We tend to think about AI in the glamorous sense, but we don't think about the AI that's being used in, say, judicial sentencing software, right? It's just replicating hyper racist, you know, in sort of hyper object way, like hyper racist sentencing processes and procedures and data. without any kind of intervening human accountability.
Hmm.
So when I think about AI, I typically think about that stuff and not the fun stuff like the insults that people are getting from
Yeah.
ChatGPT. I'm just curious about your thoughts about any of that.
Mine?
Anybody's. I mean, I'm
Um,
just bouncing off everything I've heard from you, which
Sure.
is really,
I never took
really
it
exciting.
very seriously until just a few weeks ago, and then I've been on this trip about it as an oracle and as like a way of contacting an intelligence that's free of human bias and so forth. But I hadn't heard about the application to judicial systems.
Oh yeah, that's part of
Yeah,
the,
or reading resumes and
right, exactly,
discounting resumes that don't use particular language,
exactly.
particular language typically used by men, say, in one
Yes.
example. There's plenty more.
But
When we had talked,
I can say that like AIs are programmed by individual owners, so it wouldn't be like AI across the board doing this, but just the ones owned by the prisons, owned by the courts. So like it's probably more of a perpetuation than a worsening, but it's not an improvement. So it should be looked at. And
well, I
thanks for
think it also, we talked earlier about AI colonialism, and
yeah.
this certainly applies, and you can see it beautifully, I think, in these judicial sentencing usages. And it ultimately, it's a reflection of human bias in everything. And we're looking at, it's heavily westernized. And we had discussed earlier that there is a danger, it's not even a danger, it's the reality that there are whole cultures that really have very little information about them online and therefore are locked out of AI. And so as AI is developed, we're going to lose a lot of knowledge as well as gaining knowledge. And so that is a huge problem. And especially because when you look at, and this is something we had not discussed yet, but it's very important, is the idea of isolation that can be caused by this. So let's use the example that you gave. I have a friend who's been working in California on trying to reform the bail system and trying to invent a new approach to it that's based on community. The idea being that what somebody needs when they're in trouble with the law is community. They need somebody to come in and help them and to hold them responsible and to give them opportunities. And to simply sentence somebody doesn't really address the problem of why are these situations occurring. And he's come up against a whole lot of difficulty because the system is based on avoiding responsibility in a way. We want to automate everything and then just let people who fall into the system, well, you did something wrong, so you got to go suffer that, and that's not my problem kind of thinking. And that's the opposite of what we need. And I think this also applies to the problem of environmental degradation and destruction, and the way that we need to become more sensitive as caretakers and even caregivers to the environments that we've damaged and destroyed in order to preserve as much as we can for the future. And will AI see it that way, or will it create a situation where we are so isolated? Because we were discussing earlier that AI becomes, if for instance, Elon Musk is right, and that giant factory that he built in Texas is going to be printing out these Optimus robots that have AI brains, and they're going to be our servants, our psychologists, our doctors, our comedians. I mean, everything. And if you had a creature like that in your life that was taking care of everything for you and could show you exactly the kind of compassion that suits you the best and lull you into a sense of safety, that's prime territory for addiction and for isolation. And then we can get into the whole question of what does that do to the fact that human beings seem to need to struggle and suffer on some level for our development. Mm-hmm. And we had been talking about, even before we started recording, that when one goes through the loss of loved ones, that what this does to the heart, often it opens someone with love to the whole world, because when you feel that loss, you suddenly appreciate the details and the small things in life, and you shower them with more love than you had ever felt before. Now, if we are cushioned against that by AI, so here's an example of it. There've been a lot of talk recently about, well, why would you need a medium, right? Because all you do is let AI just get all the information about the loved one that you want to contact on the other side, and let AI be the loved one.
Bring
Right?
us all out of business.
Now,
Oh,
but what's
that's
really
like the plot
happening
to a
there?
horror film right there.
Yeah. Yeah, isn't it? And what's really happening there? Isn't it self-delusion ultimately? Isn't it? I know that, I mean, I've studied a lot of different mediums for the book that I wrote, and I've known some amazing ones, especially one that was incredible, but they often shock you. They don't, I mean, the best medium I ever knew, his readings were insulting. I mean, the past lives he came up with, you felt like, oh God, I probably was that. That explains so much. It
Yeah,
wasn't comforting. It was something that made you want to be a better person and helped you to
yeah.
understand why perhaps there were blockages within you to that. And so if
That's
we
a,
get the answers we're looking for, isn't that dangerous on a level? Because
yeah.
AI seems to.
But will it be, isn't life already that dangerous though? Isn't this already like this ultimate moment where everything might always go terribly wrong or terribly right? Isn't the addition of AI to that program really just kind of an advancement of the same pattern? I'm just postulating. I can't give you an answer, but that's my perspective at the moment.
I didn't understand that, Zach. Do you
Well,
mind?
like, isn't life already a question of death or survival? Isn't already a question of enlightenment or, ignorance? Isn't it already that ultimate moment? And with or with, I mean, without AI, and if we add AI to that equation, aren't we just kind of like making it even more so, but not like any worse necessarily, just sort of more intensely the way it is? Just a question, just a thought.
Interesting.
I feel like it's not profitable to fear something unknown as your enemy because you don't know it. But I don't know it. I'm not saying I know it any better than anyone else. I'm just thinking
Of
that the
course.
Yeah, well,
automatic,
I think
like,
there's
well, it
AI,
does
like
take
AI as
posture.
a concept, right? But then there's use cases. And I
Yes.
think
Yeah,
we can definitely look at the consequences and to some degree the intentions behind these particular uses. Like in this example of creating a robot that can somehow create optimum comfort for you. This reminds me, this is going back
yeah.
a ways, but I don't know if you guys have seen My Dinner with Andre.
Hmm.
Andre tells a
Well, I
story.
Yeah.
don't remember it real well. I saw it, I think, once.
Andre tells a story. This is what hearing about those robots made me think of a woman who dies of starvation, basically, because all she likes is roast chicken or something. So she's sitting there in her, I don't know, Upper East Side apartment, just eating her chicken, making herself very, very happy. But there's, she's actually killing herself because of that lack of nutrients.
Uh,
And protecting ourselves from pain. Of course, we have that motivation, but it is a dangerous one because I think pain is something that unifies us with other creatures. Pain is kind of a message of the biosphere. It's
Hmm.
a chemical message. It's a temperature message. It's how we know where we are, who we are. And if you've ever looked in the eyes of your pet, your dog, or a horse, when it's in pain or when you're in pain, there is something very, very deep and connecting about it. It's almost, that other side of ecstasy, which is perhaps why for many it is a pathway to ecstasy.
Hmm.
Trying to I'm going to say hijack, and I know that's a questionable term, but hijack that mechanism in a way that removes us from the ecology of our being and the ecology of our relationships. I think is a little bit of a death wish. That's a little bit of a like Thanatos mechanism, at least the way I'm understanding it now.
It reminds me of the medium that I just mentioned, who was so remarkable. Used to use a phrase that reminds me of what you just said, which was "secure as a corpse."
yeah.
Everybody wants to be as secure as a corpse. And we're not here for that.
Not at all. So how did you meet Manly P. Hall? Will you tell me the story of how you first became involved? And Myshel, if you didn't know, Ronnie was Manly P. Hall's research assistant, substitute lecturer, much more, and he's from the band Lucid Nation. You might have encountered that band. And can you tell me that story, Ronnie?
Sure. Well, I was, I started out in life as a kid who felt that I had no social contract. My parents were war survivors who were very damaged, and they had me when they were quite old, and they did not know what to do with a kid. I was raised in a relatively lousy neighborhood and a relatively lousy school where, because I was a skinny kid with a slight accent, I was constantly beat up. So by the time I hit my teenage years, to me, there was no social contract, and I was all about nihilism and destructiveness, and was leaning toward criminality. The first thing that happened to me that saved me, because my first band was a terrible nihilist band that had a huge following of white supremacist bikers and just a lot of violence around me. But I was at a club one night, and Tamara was there, and she was in trouble. And she went up and asked me for help, of all people, even after she'd been warned to stay away from me by the club owner. And I was blown away by it, and it changed my life just to be asked by her to help her. So I protected her, and we wound up falling in love, and that changed me so much I couldn't be in the band anymore. But I was still really messed up, and I had really no spiritual life. What little spiritual life I had came from reading. I went to Crowley, Anton LaVey, Austin Spare, looking for evil, and they all disappointed me. They really weren't that evil. They just had an alternate point of view, and I was looking for power. And so I went to the Bodhi Tree bookstore, that was a wonderful bookstore that existed in Los Angeles for quite a while. And I had with me some money that was meant for a haircut that my parents had given me. And I was looking for a book called Atlantis, Mother of Empires, which I'd seen as a kid, and I'd wanted to shoplift this book. Now, the weird thing about this is that the book was actually by the architect of the Philosophical Research Society, which Manly Hall founded. Of course, I didn't know that. But this book had somehow struck my imagination. I couldn't find a copy of it, but I did find a very early copy. I think it was the 6th edition of The Secret Teachings of All Ages, the encyclopedic outline. This was a smaller sized tome, but it was big, thick pages and black and white pictures, but all the amazing diagrams. And it was a life changer for me. I would read a chapter and then share it with Tamara, and we talk about everything. And I talked to a friend of mine about it. At the time, I was really freaked out about earthquakes. My friends were really into Edgar Cayce, and they were all moving to Virginia Beach, and they scared me into thinking about it. And I told one of those friends about finding this book, and she said, well, he's still alive. And I said, what? I thought that the book looked so old. I just couldn't believe it. And she said, no, he lectures every Sunday just down the street from where you live. So that was a mind blower. But I didn't go for several months because of who I was and who I'd been. I just thought that the minute I walked into that place, they would all look right through me and just say, we don't want this guy around here. He's bad news. So I stalled. And then finally my girlfriend was Tamara was like, you've got to, let's go. This is ridiculous. He's in his 80s. Let's go hear him before it's too late. So I went there with her one beautiful Sunday morning, and he's up there lecturing. The amazing thing was that he looked right at me, and he said, people who have all sorts of irrational fears of earthquakes and other natural disasters because they're guilty about how they've lived their lives. Now, later on, I figured out that he couldn't see me. His eyes weren't very good at that time. He had very blurry vision. But he did do this. I mean, when I worked for him later, people would come to me and say, hey, did he ever like look at you in a lecture and say something right at you? So I don't know how he did that, but he did it. And I was so moved by him and by the place. Just the people were so amazing. The things they were talking about, it blew my mind. And I wanted to do anything possible. So that next day, Tamara and I went down there and we volunteered. They wanted her because she had office skills, but they had nothing for me. But they did ask me if I had any knowledge of languages other than English. And I said, well, yeah, I grew up in a family that spoke Russian and Polish and French and German. And yeah, I know my way around them somewhat. And so to my shock, a couple days later, I got a phone call and they said, Manly Hall wants to meet you.
Oh, wow.
So I said, okay. And I went down there and they took me to his office. I walked in, he was sitting behind this stunning carved Chinese desk. And there were four women, two on either side, these older women who were glaring at me. They were the women who ran the place. And in front of him was a big pile of paper. And he was really sweet. He looked at me and said, well, come on in and sit down and make yourself miserable. Using a kind of cross between W.C. Fields and Barrymore. And so I sat down and he asked me a few questions about my knowledge of languages. And then he pushed this stack of papers in front of me and he said, this is the galley of my bibliography of my alchemical collection. And I want you to work on it for me. And I said, I don't know anything about any of those things. I don't know what a galley is or a bibliography. And all I know about alchemy is what I've read in your book. And I'm definitely not the right person for this job. He said, no, you'll do fine. And he said, take it. And so I picked up the pages. I didn't quite know what to do. He said, just get used to it. Come in tomorrow morning and I'll give you your first assignment. But as I walked out, the vice president of the society, Pat Irvin, a very serious woman, dashed around the corner and grabbed it from me and said, that was a mistake. And I said, yes, it was. Thank you for taking this away from me. I got home that afternoon and the phone rang and it was Manly Hall's secretary. And I was told he wants to see you in his office tomorrow morning, first thing.
Wow.
So I went back the next morning, and when I went in that time, it was just him and his secretary, and he had the galley in front of him, and he pushed it in front of me again, and he said, young man, I will guide you through this process. You will meet with me in the morning. We will go over what you need to do. You can have lunch with me in the vault, and you can look over the different books, and you can ask me any question you want about them. And then in the afternoon, before we call it a day, I'll look over your work. And it'll be fine. You'll see. Well, I couldn't at that point. Oh, the other thing he said that was really key is he said, from now on, you take orders only from me.
Huh.
And if anybody else tells you anything, you come tell me.
Huh.
So just the idea of being able to sit in the vault with him and take any book I wanted and ask him where he got it and what it meant. And I mean, it was an incredible opportunity. So I took it and I just tried to be the best assistant that I could be and just listen to everything he had to say and soak up all the knowledge that I could. And we became very good friends and he became really pals with Tamara. He loved her. Tamara and I became screeners for him. So that was also an incredible experience to go through seeing people damaged by, because a lot of people came to him for help. He was like the last resort for many people who had been involved in spiritualism or ceremonial magic or other activities that opened up things in them that they didn't know. Was it an entity? Was it a psychological problem, an archetype? What's happening to me? But things are going on in my life. There were poltergeist things, all kinds of stuff. It was really eye-opening to be his screener. And then he would decide if he would meet them based on our reports about people. As Tamara writes about in her memoir, unfortunately, the one time he didn't listen to us was the guy that may have been implicated in his murder. Because we were creeped out by this guy, both of us, and we just told him, stay away from this guy. This is bad news. But he wound up so deeply involved with him that I think it was one reason why he sent us away. But the main reason he sent us away after 7 years was what he told me was that he could see that his end was near. The end was near for all the people, the old people that were running that society. And he didn't want us there. We were really young. And he said, "You're kids, you got to go have your own life. I don't want you to deal with the chaos and all these depressing realities that are about to take place. Go." And I thought he was testing me. So I kept coming back and bugging him over and over again, thinking that he was just making sure I was loyal. But he insisted that we leave. And he finally started giving me the cold shoulder about it. And it turned out to be very fortunate because, as you probably know, when he passed, it just exploded in lawsuits and criminal cases. And we were certainly not in any way suited to be able to survive that kind of process. And just seeing what happened to the place, because people started stealing. I had friends who were still there, and they were telling me these horror stories about what occurred when he was no longer in charge. So it was really one of the kindest things that he ever did for us. And he did many acts of kindness. But that's how I met him. And he was an extraordinary friend, a warm, humorous, just a beautiful human being.
Thank you very much, Ronnie. I look forward to reading your book. I'll order a copy tonight.
Well, thank you.
I'll try to get it reviewed in Glimmer Train. I mean, Rain Taxi, although they're usually more into literary stuff.
Yeah.
But I'll say, well, I did a podcast with them. I've got exclusive excerpts from the podcast, and I bet you they'll run it. Can't promise you, but I'll let you know.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that story.
Were you ever able to have the why me conversation?
The why me conversation,
yeah. I don't know what the answer to that is. I guess on one level, I do have. There was one similarity between us, I think. I would say that every other thing I kind of absorbed from him. So, for example, I love world culture. I want to know everything about everything, and that's how he was. And I think that his example showed me that. But we both had the ability to synthesize huge amounts of material quickly. And I think that he recognized that in me pretty quick. And obviously, he didn't know it when he gave me the job, but when he started to work with me and saw what I was capable of, he found that he could depend on me on certain levels. And that's how I became his designated substitute lecturer, because I had a similar style. I saw that he would basically lecture on the things he was studying. And it was amazing. This man was in his mid 80s. Not only could he say to me, "I need this book. This is the title. This is the author. You'll find it on the second shelf upstairs in the right-hand corner." I mean, he knew everything about this, and many times would send Tamara or I out there looking for books for him that way. But also, he loved to find the connections and the reflections in things, and this is something that I love too. And so my book, in a sense, it literally started in that vault, because the book began when there was this big leather-bound volume, and I grabbed it and said, "What's this?" And he said, "Open it up." And so I opened it, and it said The Platonist, and it was a newspaper that was published in St. Louis, Missouri, around the time of the gunfight at the OK Corral. And it contained translations, some of them by Thomas Taylor, but also new translations of Plotinus and Iamblichus and Plato, of course. But there were also things in it, like there was a translation of Eliphas Levi's Transcendental Magic, a key text of ceremonial magic, by Abner Doubleday, who was a Civil War general who'd been falsely credited with inventing baseball. And I just could not understand how this thing came to exist. I mean, why would anybody publish a newspaper devoted to Plato at the time of the gunfight at the OK Corral on what was then the Western frontier? And even Manly Hall.
All manner of such publications in that vault. This
is true. That's what I found out basically. Now Manly Hall didn't know much about it either, because there just wasn't much information. I eventually ran down a book published in 1962 that I think was called Platonists of the Midwest, that explained some things about that publication, but it raised more questions than it answered. And then starting in the 2000s, but particularly starting in the 2010s, there was an explosion of academic study in this area. And so all this information that had not been previously available was suddenly available, and I was able to find these incredible connections. So, for example, Thomas Johnson, who was the publisher of The Platonist, was also a vice president in the Theosophical Society. He was the head of the Western Lodge of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor. And he was the first person in America to publish anything about Sufism.
Wow.
And so he connected in all these ways to other organizations. It was really fascinating. And so that led ultimately to the book, because I just kept researching, and it was like pulling on a string, and it just kept unraveling and connecting to everything, and into politics and culture. And it revealed that America was never really a predominantly Christian country. And I argue in the book that Christianity in America is not what Christianity was in Europe and in the Middle East, that it really resembles American metaphysical religion more than it resembles Christianity, in that the pursuit of happiness has taken the central place here. And if you look at the history of Christianity, happiness was not what it was about. We were here to suffer and to be tested, and poverty was a good thing. And now all of a sudden in America, Christianity transformed into, no, God wants you to be rich. God wants you to be happy. God wants you to have a good sex life with your wife. So this is so different from what Christianity originally was. And it completely changed my vision of it. So I don't know, to answer your question, which I didn't answer here, why was it me? I feel so humbled that it was me that got to have that experience. And I guess I'm suited for it in the sense that I was able to understand the teachings that he was able to give. But I think that maybe the reason it happened isn't a reflection on me. It's that he lived this kind of Taoist way of life. He felt like nature was collaborating with him. And so I think when I walked in there at a time when he needed a new editor for this project because the old editor was not following his directions, he just trusted that the universe gave him the right person. I'm very lucky
I think that's how he's able to speak to you without seeing you too. To speak in your direction and say just what that person needs to hear without seeing who it is.
Yeah, he was in some kind of a connection with nature, a Taoist kind of stance in life that made synchronicities happen around him so much. And I've spoken to other people who were around him who also said, I know, right? I mean, there was always synchronicities around him. And I have to say also that his office had a vibe. Wow. I mean, it was filled with art from Japan and China, and I don't know what it was. He lived in there for decades, making his work every day, but you'd walk in there and it was the most peaceful, tranquil. It just felt like you were walking into the best temple ever. And the weird thing was that when he became too ill to lecture, and even after he had sent us away, a guy took over there briefly who had been the main moving force behind Live Aid. And I was asked to come meet with him. And when I did, I walked in that office. Most of the stuff was still there, but the vibe was gone. So I guess it was him. But that was another thing I noticed about him, the serenity, the tranquility. The only thing I can associate it with is things like Shinto and Taoism.
Right on. Well, that was so inspiring.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it's great to hear that.
I'm always happy to talk about him or answer questions about him. I wish more people knew about him. His lectures are so great.
I found a copy of The Secret Teachings of All Ages in my parents' bookshelves when I was a teenager, and I don't know what happened to it, but I remember it. I remember the picture of him. He had white hair at the time, short white hair.
Oh, I know the one you had. Yeah. That's the Jubilee edition.
I don't think I was ready to internalize metaphysical perspectives on it anyway at the time, but I wish I had it still, and I guess it's calling me, so I'll probably find it eventually somewhere.
Oh, you will.
Did Zach already ask you what religious tradition you grew up in and why you had this exposure to so many languages?
My parents were atheists, and they did not believe in things like life after death. Or, in fact, my father was one of those old school males who used the word imagination interchangeably with effeminate or
Oh, right.
insane. And so he would always say to me, "I don't have that kind of imagination." And if you want a brief but inspiring story, um, so my father would we'd get in fights about this because I would tell him, like, when I had a near death experience, I told him about it, and he said, "Oh, I don't have that kind of imagination." Got pissed at me about it whenever I would do things like that. I wanted to be an artist, a musician, a poet, and he was just, ugh, imagination. That's
Imagination again.
not for men. And so
Imagination, it's not
it's not for
a
men.
man's
And so as he got older, he got sick,
job. Very
and
interesting.
we did our best to take care of him and to do what we could to help him along. And he became a little more open, and we became more friendly. And when he was actually in a coma, I performed powwow, even though I was told that he was unconscious. And after he passed, I was so overburdened by all the things that one has to do, as you know all too well, Zach. And so I had a minor back injury. I thought was very symbolic of that. And I was told, go see this person in Laurel Canyon who's an expert on releasing trauma. So I went there, and this was a very pleasant guy, very quiet, and he was basically doing a combination of meditation and body work. But as he was standing over me, he said, all I told him was that my dad had recently died, and that was it. And that I was overwhelmed by all the things that I had to deal with. And as he started to work on me, I saw he had this expression of consternation and confusion. And then he said, "Okay, I am not a medium, and I never do this, but I have this feeling that your father is here, and it's so strong. And he keeps repeating something to me to tell you, and I have to tell you." And I said, "All right, what's my dad saying?" I thought I was being hustled. He said, "He wants you to know that he's learning to love his imagination."
Right on.
That was an amazing moment for me.
Yeah.
What a coincidence, right? So I didn't really have religion when I was a kid, and I was around languages because I was around all these immigrants who had moved here after World War II. My whole family was coming out of Russia and France and Germany and Poland, and so that's why I had an accent when I was a kid, because I was born here, but I was never really allowed to hang out with people. They had that paranoid immigrant kind of mentality. So I learned English with an accent from all these people that didn't speak it very well that I was around. So that accident of fate was so key to that moment with Manly Hall.
Fascinating how that family lineage was actually so intimately tied up with
Isn't
you
it?
connecting with him. And
Compensation in a way.
may I ask another question, Zach? I don't want to take up all your time.
No, please.
Thank you. Speaking of lineage, do you consider yourself to be part of his lineage now, since he was such a profound teacher? Or how do you kind of position yourself in terms of your own practice?
Hmm. Well, when representing, how do I say this? When being asked questions, especially about him, I do feel that I owe it to him to represent him in a fashion that he would approve of, if you will. So the same question happened with Tamara, because she wrote a memoir about our friendship with him, and then she had to go out and do these interviews, and she was a riot girl, and she was really used to dealing with trolls and hecklers, and she had this punk way of just hilariously insulting them and just really good at it. And so here she is dealing with getting some trolling as she's out there doing this stuff, but she felt that she shouldn't say the things that she was thinking because she was kind of representing him. And he was so wholesome and so sweet and so well mannered. And we just felt we have to in some way let people experience in our own small way what it was like to be in his presence by trying to keep those same high standards while we represent him. And so as far as practice, I feel that, I mean, I'm always thinking about things that he told us. He did teach us a few exercises like the Pythagorean recollection, which is when you go to bed at night, you go over your day backwards and you look at what things you maybe could have done better, which is a really wonderful way to become more self-aware and to learn how to use your life in a better way. And I think about things he said about walking meditation, for example, because we once asked him, well, do you meditate? And he said, I don't have to anymore because my life is something like the Zen walking meditation. And I'm always in meditation. And so that was something to aspire to. And I found that the irony of it is that when I was in music, I really loved being just Tamara's guitar player. Nobody knew that I had this background. And we both really liked being anonymous and just being who we were in our punk rock band. And we were avoiding that history. And what happened was that a very dear friend of ours, who was also a friend of his, this incredible guitar player, Arthur Johnson, who played with Lena Horne and all these great jazz people. And he was Manly Hall's driver and also sometimes, and also his audio engineer. So most of the lectures that you hear of Manly Hall from the 70s and after were recorded by Arthur. And he called us one day. He'd been getting ill over time, and he called us and he said that the end was in sight. And he had a 2-foot stack of unfinished manuscripts, poems and essays and esoteric writing. And he didn't get to digitize it. He didn't get to finish it. He never got to put it out. And with this intense gravity of his near passing, he told us, do your work, write your books, write down what you've learned. He told Tamara, you had such a unique friendship with this man. You had a perspective on him no one else ever had. You need to write it down now so you don't wind up like I am, choking in the claustrophobia of the end of your life, realizing that you didn't accomplish these things. He scared the crap out of us. I mean, really. And in fact, the first book that we worked on, because we work on everything together, even though there's, the memoir was hers because it was predominantly hers, but we collaborate on everything. She wrote it partly for him, she put a lot of jokes about him in it and stuff. And she was getting ready to send it to him for his birthday, and he died before it got there. And that really got us. So we started to write all of this down. And as we did that, it's almost like it was like this reawakening of the relationship with him, and whatever the if you want to call it inheritance or whatever of the friendship had brought to us. And so now as we go out into the world, for me, so my spiritual practice has partly become having to change from the person who liked to quietly sit behind Tamara and just be a guitar player to being somebody who's willing to talk about these things with strangers. And
I don't think you sat quietly behind Tamara as a guitar player.
You're right.
I've heard Prowler,
that's true. We were very loud.
Anyway,
but yes,
I know what you mean.
Yeah, so it became like now the practice becomes, how do I speak about him and about these experiences, and how to become comfortable being in the public sphere, letting anybody hear these things that were once these very precious kind of secrets to us.
Wow.
So, and then that comes from love, right? Because it's not ambition. I mean, I'm not doing this to make money. I certainly don't think that a $40 paperback, the 600 pages, is going to make money in this day and age. And I didn't do it to become well known. I did it because I thought the information was something that could actually move the needle a little bit in terms of America's awareness of
Yes.
itself. And
Yeah.
so I have this feeling of, I do have a lust for results in a sense that I have to fight, because I want the book to be read, because I hope that all these people I've written about, when you find out about them, that people will feel emboldened and inspired in ways to reinvent America and to reinvent their spirituality. And so, but I have to fight that lust for result, because it still gets in the way. It still causes frustration or overreaction or trying to do too much. And I've had to convert it really to love, to trying to each person that I speak to, I try to feel them and to give them something useful to take away from it. And I still get comments from people who say, he says the same shit all the time. He's not saying anything that's any use to anybody. Because there are people like that who just feel triggered and they react. And so that's the path for me right now, more or less, is being able to, in fact, let me say that for me, the spiritual path has always been so ass backwards, because coming out of atheist parentage and my nihilistic attitude as a kid and everything, I never believed in any of it. I mean, I didn't believe in God. I had the hardest time, even when I was working for him, of really feeling something like that in prayer, let alone that, And then I was very fortunate, because at each point in my life, I met somebody who said something to me or changed how I viewed things. So, for instance, when it came to prayer, which I always thought was the ultimate in futility, I had a discussion with John Trudell about that. And John, really amazing human being. If your listeners don't know, he was an activist in the American Indian movement, and he was one of the occupiers at Alcatraz, and he became a great poet. And one day we were just sitting at the kitchen table talking about stuff, and I said something about prayer, and I asked him, actually Tamara asked him, what do you think about prayer? And he said, oh, I pray all the time. He said, prayer is good. It's an electromagnetic interaction with the world. It's much better than hoping, because hoping is static. It's stagnant. But prayer is identifying something and reaching out to a higher intelligence for greater clarity. And that is valuable. And that started me. Then as you run into things in life that make you pray because you face the angst of mortality and such, that opened up a world for me. So that's part of it too, is trying to share. I am somebody who was angry and very unspiritual, and I get it. So when there's people out there who are despairing and dark and angry and they want to do destructive things, I know them. I was that guy. And so I try to share this information to help them, because the way that he helped me, that he had all this information, and being around someone like that can really inspire you to overcome those difficulties that you have every right to be angry about, and to doubt in the existence of a God and all the rest of the things that life in the modern world causes, that alienates ourselves from our innermost self.
Right.
So there's a long answer for you about it. That's basically the practice now.
Very good. Well, I feel gifted by your conversation. I feel pleased by our interaction. I'm grateful. I've made a
Thank
new
you.
friend.
Myshel, great questions. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have anything more to add or ask
You have
me or
been such
anything?
wonderful hosts of your party crasher tonight. So thank you.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you came. I'm always looking for a balance in energy, and it's two men. I always feel like if it's all one gender, it's too much.
You're the
Too much
first
one
person
way.
of the female
You
gender
gave
to
me the
ask me.
magic time.
You're the first female who's asked me questions. I mean, it's been like such a sausage fest, right? I mean, it's just all men, and I've been feeling bad about it because. Oh
That's
wait,
how it's been
I
with your
talked to
press
Bonnie
store in
Bloomgarden
general,
too.
huh?
Yeah, there's so many men in podcasting, and we really need
Yeah.
more women, I think. And I did do
Well,
an
I'm
interview
trying
with.
to zip it because I have a million more questions I could ask you, but I'll save them for
Oh,
another
please.
time.
Okay,
I mean, you're
sure.
probably getting tired at this
I'd love
point.
to. Yeah, anytime, either one of you, Zach, I'm good to go. So just let me know if you'd like to.
All right, we'll do this again sometime. You've been an excellent guest.
Thank you.
Do you have anything to ask me or tell me, Myshel?
Well, I was just going to ask you guys if you've read Shards of Love.
I
Some
have
of the
not.
things that you're talking about, especially this kind of well, maybe not willfully corrosive, but potentially corrosive understanding of what American spirituality has really looked like, right? As opposed to this attempt to create a very linear narrative. The way we want to position ourselves now is kind of teleological storytelling, that it was always going to be here. Creating breaking up that narrative and creating a sense of what the possibilities always were and still are, I think is a great service. And that book does a similar thing around medieval Spain and our understanding of what the relationships between Jews, Christians, and Muslims were in
Oh,
Andalus.
I'd love to read that. Could I get a link from somebody for that? I would.
I will send it to Zach and he can forward it to you, or maybe
I'll
Zach.
forward it to your Facebook
It
page.
has a lot
Okay.
of rock and roll
Yes, with
references too.
Sure, I would love it. And also, if you're on IG or Facebook or anything like that, please find me,
Yeah.
Ronnie Pontiac. Just easy. Yeah, I found. I'll leave you with one story that's just so great because
Sure.
you mentioned that. So, for example, we have this very strict idea about pilgrims and what they were about. And let's talk for a moment about John Winthrop, the original governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony. He has a kid, John Winthrop Jr., John Winthrop the Younger, who was the first governor of Connecticut Colony. And this kid was way into the occult.
Well,
He owned a lot of John Dee's library. He
no
went
kidding.
to Europe searching for Rosicrucians. He was a practicing alchemist. When he couldn't find Rosicrucians in Europe, he came back and devoted his life to living out the Rosicrucian ideals, and he did. He became this incredible frontier doctor using alchemical, mostly Paracelsian style formulas to heal people all over the territory, and actually organized a group of women to go out and diagnose. And he had these color-coded pills that he would give to people. And so when he moved to the United States, it wasn't even the United States yet, when he moved to the colonies to follow his father, his crates that were filled with books and alchemical equipment were marked with the symbol of John Dee's Monas Hieroglyphica, one of the most notorious occult symbols of the time. So I usually say this would be like having a Southern pastor's kid draw pentagrams on his luggage.
Right.
And this is
Wow.
right here at the mother of the beginnings of the colonies.
Wow.
That's just one example. Even I'll give you one quick one. Cotton Mather, who we think of as this very strict Christian and who went after the witches, he described John Winthrop the Younger in his eulogy for him as Hermes Christianus, the Christian
Wow.
Hermes.
Holy cow.
So clearly the pilgrims were not what we've been taught that they were.
Not even, yeah.
Yeah.
Goodness. Well, I'll definitely be ordering a copy. It sounds like a fascinating read.
I hope so. It's got a lot of those stories. There's a lot of interesting people in there. And it also taught me that even there's so many frauds, but even the frauds had wisdom, many of them.
Yeah, that's a fascinating observation.
Mm-hmm.
Those are super interesting stories. When I worked with the music producer and songwriter Sandy Pearlman for a long time, and in his studio in the bathroom, taped to the mirror, it said "Objects in mirrors. Objects in mirror are weirder than they appear."
That's great.
That's always true, isn't it?
Always. Well, this was delightful. Thank you so much. And I do hope we can do it again. I would love to.
I'll definitely do it again. I'll try to provide a more varied pantheon of guests, maybe 6 or 7 next time.
You know, I'm okay with
genders and races and
I'm okay with just having my show.
This
that would
was
be
an
okay
excellent
too.
trinity we got here tonight. I'm very glad you made it, Myshel.
Yeah.
And I wish you both excellent continued evenings.
Thank
The
you.
Zoom shutdown is very rude and real, so get ready.
Have a
I
good
hope
night, you
you're
all.
well. Good night.